many presentations about the wonderful system for the management of petroleum in Norway, and also in many other exotic countries. Today, we are going to hear about international NGOs, big global NGOs, which are engaged in the field of natural resource management. And first out is Mona Thowsen, who plays a very central role in the organization Publish What You Pay, and is the leader of Publish What You Pay in Norway, and is going to tell about their work.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and I was very fortunate to be also in Moscow a few months ago. I don't know if any of you were there. You were there? Hello, hello, hello. This is not the same presentation, so this is a different presentation. But obviously, we are working on the same issues, and you're really concerned with accounting, as I remember. Yeah. Mm. So I will not go more into depth there now, so we'll leave that depth. We can do it later. I think that my role here would be to talk about some of the issues that the other actors that you have been meeting, I've seen in the program you've been through, have not talked so much about. I recognize you very well. We're good to talk afterwards. What we do in Norway, we are a small node in a network, in an international network. There are 800 organizations worldwide, operating from around 70 countries, working on financial transparency. We're targeting corruption and capital flight in developing countries, in the extractive industries. And why do we do that? 2/3 of the poorest people in the world live in resource-rich countries, and more people will be living in resource-rich countries in the future. The problem is that these are the resources of the people. Has anybody talked about that in Norway? That's what we say. The natural resources belongs to the people. Yes? Do you agree? Yeah? Mm-hmm. So the point is, if we are the investors, we would like to follow our money, right? That's the primary job of an investor, is to follow your investments. You need to know where your money is going. So that's the area that we're going to dig a little bit into, because what we are doing in Publish What You Pay Norway, in our little chapter, is that we are producing knowledge about where are the leakages. How does it happen? Which mechanisms and leakages are working together? How is it made possible? Which transparency mechanisms can do anything with what problems? We also try to make this knowledge into an integrated capacity building program that we're running. So up to now, over 100 people has been trained in this. We also try to share information, both from Norway, what we are working on, and from the people we cooperate with in our network, to share here in Norway. Because this is not something that everybody in Norway is aware of. I think we have 490 likes on Facebook. That's not a lot. We're not many people in Norway, but we would like to reach out to more people. So it's a kind of a specialized thing. So an encouragement, if you want to join us, please follow us on Facebook and Twitter and connect with us. But the point is that the extractive industry, oil, gas and mining, it's one of the most secretive businesses, the most powerful businesses in the world. Often they have more profit, they have more economic powers than the countries in which they invest and operate in. That has impact on us as the investors. We would like to know where the money is going. So the main problem in the natural rich countries in the world, they are very poor. And I know that you'll be going through that with the resource curves, so I will leave that. I will not talk about that. The point is that natural resources hasn't been translated into a common good for the citizens. And a large percentage of the citizens can be said to be held as a sort of a hostage in poverty because their economic potential has been robbed from them. Let's look at some figures. It's almost 7 times the value of international aid, the resource rent. You see the difference, the resource rent versus aid in Southern Sahara? I think the number speaks for itself. Aid is very, very small. That's not what the goal is for anyone, to have a country's aid dependent. The point is, there's a lot of money in the system. So where are these money going? Where are they being invested? To what are they transformed? So what we have learned is that we need to include a variety of disciplines, from economics, from accounting, from politics, law, media, to see in a larger context, why is this happening? What can we do about it? How can these big funds be transformed into a common good? Since we are in Norway, we need to use a Norwegian example. Tax payments from Statoil to one country, Angola, was on 90 billion. In comparison, Norwegian aid to the whole of Africa south of Sahara was on 40 billion. This is larger than aid. We are talking about huge numbers here. The point is still, this industry generates enormous amounts, much more than aid. But does these tax payments create development? That's what we are working with, and that's what we are commenting on in our work. These are some of the reports that we have been working on. The terminology corruption has been known for many years now. It's been widely globalized. We more or less have a good understanding of what that is. It's harmful to development. And still, secrecy, and particularly secrecy jurisdictions, also called tax havens, are a terminology which is not so familiar still for the role they play. Even less familiar are the role of the actors that are facilitating and supporting corrupt practices and using tax havens in order to convert it very easily from one part of the economy to the other. It's very easily done when you have a black box of secrecy to convert something which is illicit to something which is completely illegal. You can transfer it into the regular economy. The point is that there's also a lack of accounting data. There is very little requirements for companies to produce the figures that can hold them accountable for where the money is actually ending up. In the reporting, one of these reports, in the Piping Profit, the first one here, we learned that 10 of the companies, largest oil and mining companies in the world, they operate with at least 6,000 subsidiaries, of which 1/3 is located in tax havens. One might ask, why is that? What exactly is on offer in a tax haven, which a regular bank in Norway cannot help them with? Also, 6,000 subsidiaries. this is just information that we found by trawling already public data on stock exchanges, calling to business register, finding information already in the public domain. So this is a minimum standard. It's a minimum. It's a tip of the iceberg. There are a whole range of forms of companies that are not listed or communicated. So the number would be bigger. So when companies are using secrecy jurisdictions, it means that no government in the whole world is able to see what is really going on. They are not able to see the whole picture. Governments are allowed to see one small puzzle of a larger picture. So when you see in isolation just one piece of puzzle, you can't see the whole picture. That's the same thing with a company. You don't know what the full picture is when you have this little information, piece of information. So what the tax havens does is that they effectively, you have the information flow and then you have the black box and you cut off the relevant information. I'll come back to that with a little more of a description. Another report that we produced, we called Lost Billions. It's very interesting that today the world trade actually is happening mostly inside companies already. 60% of the world trade is going on within corporations. 60%. And that means that the trade is taking place across national borders, but within the companies. And it emphasizes the importance of transfer pricing. OECD has some guidelines on that. You're going to give an arm's length principle if you are conducting business with a company within your own corporation. To which degree that is followed, it's almost impossible to validate. And also, another problem is that we might talk about the physical takeout of oil and minerals and gas, but trade with crude oil is a central aspect of the extractive industries. It doesn't always have to be with the physical and geographical extraction of resources. It's happening in investment houses and through use of quite complex financial instruments, papers. And one of the most perhaps complicated financial instruments that is being used by the extractive industries to a high degree, which we found in the report on which we did on derivatives, it's that derivatives can be misused by the extractive industry in order to move profit across countries. And the way of using derivatives has not been very much exposed, but they have enormous impact. When it is possible to shift away 20% of a country's profit before it's being taxed, that has huge implication on a country's economy. So you might have heard about the investor Warren Buffett. He was the one who called derivatives financial weapons of mass destruction. We also looked into which role are lawyers playing into this picture. The nice thing about lawyers is they have a confidentiality. They can protect information. Some companies have been using that to a large extent to diversify their advisors, so none of the legal advisors may see the full picture necessarily, but together everybody can say that we can't talk about this. So you also have an effective secrecy mechanism to be used, and it's used quite strategically. And also, there's another development which can be seen as interesting in relation to this. For example, using again an example from Norway, I'm sure many people have told you good things about Norway, so my role is to talk about some of the more problematic sides, which also is happening in our own country. For example, Norwegian oil companies can now, according to a rule in the Supreme Court in Norway, have protection under the human rights against insight. It's the principle of self-incrimination that is used, but this is a ruling in the Supreme Court, the highest court. The effect is that it will prevent the public from insight into the companies. So forced disclosure of key financial information to the police, for example, will be prevented. It just raises some interesting questions, all of this in total. For example, on the distribution of basic human rights, who are able to get right in a political system if you build up huge financial muscles and you can hire all the lawyers that you need. How would the prosecution authority and the capacity be on the other side? In a developing country, they would be chanceless. So what we are talking about here is the fiction industry when all of this is working together. I will not go into all of this, it will be too much. We have all of the reports online, and if you see one of the areas that you might be interested in, we can go into that. We'll be looking at windfall taxes, we'll be looking at mechanisms for writing legal contracts, demanding transparency, and so and so. But it gives you an impression of the stuff we're dealing with here. So again, the fiction industry is what we call it when all of these mechanisms are working together. Facilitators, banks, shell companies. For example, the World Bank have been looking at 200 cases of corruption where 70% of the cases they had been using shell companies, which have been constructed by facilitators, obviously. And what does this mean exactly? Calculations from Global Financial Integrity has been making some estimates on financial flows to and from developing countries. The aid, again, in this perspective becomes incredibly small when it's compared with the leakages. So where should we focus then when we work as a civil society? Should we focus on the 1 Norwegian krone that we give in aid? Or should we perhaps focus some more on the 10 which is leaked out from a country? Who are familiar with a tax haven? Yeah. So you have, okay. Let me just say something about a tax haven, because obviously there are many people who have not maybe delved into what that really is. So first, the terminology tax haven is a bit misleading. I'm using it because that's a terminology that many people use and are familiar with. It can be used quite interchangeably with secrecy jurisdiction. Some call it bank havens. There are many reasons for calling it with different names. Hence, there's also no agreed upon definition on what it is. And one definition cannot capture everything that is on offer in the different jurisdictions, because these are different places. But it's about interfering in other people's jurisdictions, maybe. A tax haven may say that we have our own jurisdiction, nobody can tell us what we do, but their laws are designed in a way that makes it possible for companies who do not live there or operate there, originate from there, can hide information or can avoid their legal obligations in their home country. So we try to make our own little definition to use, which is that secrecy jurisdictions offer law structures which are especially designed to conceal information about activities and ownership which concern other states and particularly harm and undermine an international regulation and the level of democracy. So when we were looking at the 10 of the biggest oil companies in the world, we found that their preferred destination to be in was in Delaware in the US and in the Netherlands. So many countries give a great, appearance of international legitimacy. I mean, what's wrong with the Netherlands? We know a bit more now the last years, but and they also help when you see this in a bigger picture and you use many tax havens. Remember, the companies had 6,000 subsidiaries that we knew of, which of 1/3 was located in the secrecy jurisdictions. You might just start envisioning this whole map of structures which will appear and which is quite different from the substance that is actually happening. So you're creating this form and it looks like companies are registered in countries, but in reality they're not really responsible anywhere. So the substance is in examples like Amazon, Google, Starbucks that you pay next to nothing in tax. That's a substance in these structures. I was just thinking, so what domestic consequences does this have for Russia? I am not an expert on Russia. Indra is the go-to guy, which the whole of media in Norway goes to whenever there are questions about Russia. But just some small figures that I wanted to put out on the slide is that through this period from 1994 to 2011, Russia seemed to have lost more than 200 billion to illicit financial outflows. There has been indicated supposed links between the state and overall governance and the volume. Also, there has been uncovered the connection to Cyprus as the largest source of Russian investments. It's been called the biggest whitewashing machine for Russia. So that is the Russian picture in this bigger picture. Global financial integrity will have a lot more information about many different countries that you might be interested in, and you will find numbers on all of the countries. And I also found something else. You have something called the Odnodnevniki. Is it familiar? So what we can read on the internet is that there are almost 4 million companies registered as that. And what is that? It's a one-day company. Very, very interesting. One-day company. But again, for example, in the oil and gas and mining industry, that's no surprise. That's what they do. You know, they create companies and terminate companies on a daily basis, you know, for their purposes. So it doesn't come as a surprise, but it does have impact on the level of transparency and also the amount coming into the treasure box. So I just saw it as a interesting feature, local feature. All countries have their different features. But who's going to talk about this? Who's going to be the people who inform us about what's going on? And I saw that the former head of the central bank in Russia, Sergei Ignatiev, he said that shadowy operation to transfer money abroad were worth the equivalent of about 2.5% of Russia's annual GDP. And he also said something more interesting, that 50% of a legal transfer can be tracked back to one organization, he said. And then it was said also in the same interview that he refused to identify which. But obviously he's talking about it, saying what he can. Who else can be sharing what is going on? The journalists are very important, but the level of freedom of the press worldwide in 2014, the red areas are indicating difficult situations. And that was also one of the discussion points in Moscow, the media situation and also what information comes out. So obviously, whatever is not told or shared in a public domain is not being discussed. And journalists are many times the most important links who can tell us about what's going on in the real world out there. How can we understand it? How can we interpret it so that we can know what's going on and make informed decisions? And when we are not told what's going on, will become blank fields in our brains. We don't know about it. And how can we act upon it? And we see also, like Thomas Piketty, a famous author these days, he's also pointing out the extreme level of inequality that we see in the world, that you have capital concentrations, which is dangerous. International opportunities, which are they? I could say a few opportunities that exist. All of these opportunities will have their own weaknesses, their strengths, their focus areas, and will have been influenced by some groups. But this is what's on the international agenda right now, which you may influence if there are open and transparent processes. One of these are the EITI, and I know that you will be you'll have a presentation of that after me. The EITI has been a very interesting development. Civil society demanded transparency from countries and also from banks giving loans to those countries. At that time, in 2002, any extractive companies could say, we paid this to Asia in this big bag, we paid this to Africa or this region, Africa, in this big bag. But we didn't know to which country. So EITI is about payments to a country and to receive a country. We've also done that in Norway. Statoil said it was no problem. The same principles, payment and receipt, has been implemented in law in the US and the EU, and is called a basic country-by-country reporting or tax payments. Problem here, the companies in the board of the EITI is fighting the same principles when in law. No surprise. So the point that we are working on in Norway, the most important policy mechanisms that we've been communicating with the OECD, the IMF, the EU Commission, is the extended country-by-country reporting. Easy point. Any figure seen in isolation makes very, very little sense. It just stands there alone. If an accountant sees one number, what's that? What can you do with that? So what can that really tell us? The tax payment alone. Remember everything that happens before tax, how it's possible to shift? Well, extended country-by-country reporting is, we need the context. A figure in isolation doesn't make sense. You need to have a meaningful context, something to relate it to. So extended country-by-country reporting is that tax payments need to be presented in its logical context. You need to know what's taken out, how you've been shifting the profit. And you need the form. The reporting must be linked to the consolidated financial accounts, which are already audited. And you can put that in the notes to the account. That seems to be very dangerous. We are here now. This is the minimum country-by-country reporting, Dodd-Frank and the EU. What we have in Norway is the extended country-by-country reporting, but we have 3 red flags, 3 holes. So where are we in Norway on that? 15 of the 18 elements we have been asking for is in place. 3 elements are missing. It's the cost aspect. It's covering all the countries, including the tax havens, and it has to be audited figures. So what we do? Well, we point it out so more and more people get it. It's very logical. If you see if you want to look at a company, you see in their financial accounts. That's the main instrument where you go if you want to see something as an investor to follow your money. So holding financial information away from the accounts should be a question to raise. And it's very easy to put that information in notes to the account, not to present arbitrary figures, not to keep main functions as tax havens away from the reporting. You need this information from all the countries. So the main functions for corruption and capital flight are kept out of the transparency mechanisms. So if policymakers and officials and others agree that these are really logical concepts, why don't you agree? Well, the problem is that sometimes a policy proposal does what it says on the tin. So without extended country-by-country reporting, you will see money locked in to all of the tax havens, big locks on all of those countries. The information will not come out. With the extended country-by-country reporting, you will see where the money has ended up. Obviously, that might pose a problem for someone. I wanted to talk about OECD and IMF, but I see that I'm out of time. How much time do I have? 2 minutes. So the OECD is one track, one international track right now. The problem with the OECD approach is that there's huge exemptions. They're not wanting to have this information in the public domain. Tax policies are being agreed by a group of countries where tax havens are members, and over 100 developing countries are not even invited in to be heard. And it is a great risk of undermining progress made in other fields. We made some comments on that. I will not go into that. Another process is the IMF. The IMF is really coming, much better out of this process. What they're saying is that we see that tax havens are harmful. We see that developing countries might lose up to 15%. So they're onto something. The problem with some of the definitions is that they're looking at high net individuals, and they have to look closer on the cases on the ground. Really, that's our main feedback, because the definition of how this problem looks like, it doesn't reflect very well the case situations on the ground around the world. So we made some comments also there. The point is that you need to be taxed where you do the business, or where you convert it into something else, or where you sell your product, for example. And also we recommend extended country-by-country reporting, because it will bring you information about where the money is. So in conclusion, opportunities to influence right now is the EITI, Dodd-Frank, EU Transparency Directive, OECD, IMF. The UN is also had a process. It's a bit unclear right now where we are on that, on a convention on transparency that harms other countries, tax havens. So what is needed is obviously civil society who discuss such issues, who is informed and demands transparency, and also to connect to international networks so we can use each other's knowledge and insight across disciplines and across countries in order to influence rules and regulations. That's not all that is needed. We have a whole range of problems in all countries, but in terms of this little narrow aspect, this is one of the issues needed. So I just wanted to end on a positive note that we did influence rules in the US with the Dodd-Frank. We did influence rules in the EU with the Transparency and Accounting Directive. We did influence rules in Norway with the country-by-country reporting, which is going further. And we did this because we are working together. So our experience is that we can make transparency possible. It's not easy, but we can. And you're hereby invited to join into our network, those of you who think that's relevant for your work. And please do connect with us. And if you have any questions, just write.
Thank you very much, Mona. We have a little while for some questions. I think you were first.
Was this a point I should move
Sorry,
between?
right, you stay here. But we need to put this, you will need that too. Okay. So the best is to have them both.
Okay.
There, if possible, let me see there.
Sure.
And then this. Okay. And then
It's already turned on.
Is it the correct channel?
Можно переводчиков попросить? Do you hear?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes,
Excellent.
thank you.
Okay. Сейчас.
Если можно, вот слайд вернуть, где Норвегия не выполняет условия.
Bra lysbilde.
Пока вы возвращаете слайд, у меня такой вопрос я сформулирую. Скажите, пожалуйста, чем официальные лица объясняют невыполнение и используют ли оппозиционные партии сам факт невыполнения для того, чтобы добиться того, чтобы Норвегия выполняла все требования, все 5 требований?
So you're looking at the counter arguments that are being used.
Да, контраргументы властей и использует ли оппозиция для того, чтобы добиться, чтобы Норвегия выполняла все 5.
That's a good question. We've been working 10 years with the counter arguments, and we've been developing our counter arguments to the counter arguments. And obviously, this is a huge battle. The problem is that, for example, in Norway, our main company, Statoil, they have around 200 communication advisors. We cannot match that. When we were in the EU Commission presenting a proposal, actually they were a bit angry with us, saying, why didn't you come before? Because we could have put this into a process earlier and then we could have influenced this. And now we've been having all these lobbyists and they want to sit on a lap while we write the regulation. It's good to have you here, but, you know, we need to hear you. But at that point, we hadn't really produced the material we had, and we couldn't even afford the flight ticket to Brussels. So it's a bit different. Our experience today, after 10 years, and we've been talking to investors, we've been talking to the companies, we've been talking to many different sections in companies, financial sectors, CSR sectors or departments. We've been talking to politicians on a whole range of, from liberals to conservatives, you name it. And we've been talking to statistical bureaus, we've been talking to leaders in financial sectors. And the point is that when we sit down and when we go through the arguments one by one, we're showing it very, very simple. This is what it's about. They seem to nod and agree, and that's obvious, you know, like obviously it's the financial accounts that's important. I mean, you know, when I want information, I don't want somebody to pop up arbitrary figures. Where did they come from? Are they audited? And when it's large revenue sum, when we're talking billions and our own money, it becomes even more important. But every argument in isolation can be almost proved wrong. We've had 10 years and we've heard the craziest things. But the problem is, this will actually does what it says on the tin. So the core problem is, do you want to have the facts on the table? Do you want to see where the money ends up? It might be difficult for some companies who had invested a lot in keeping money out from the market, but it's not good for competition. So one of the main arguments is competition. In Norway, can this be good for competition? Well, the point is, if you have a multinational company and they come here to Norway and they do not pay any tax, they have access to a well-educated population, a good health service, a positive environment where it's possible to debate and you can get input, easy access to politics, very transparent, and you have huge, you can sign off huge costs on the public that we as taxpayers are paying. So you get access to all of this. But when a small Norwegian company shall compete and pay 28% in tax, it's hard to compete with companies who does not pay tax. So for a national narrative and a national competition, it is today we have the difficult competitive situation where the companies who remove the most and the highest volumes of profit from the market are being rewarded. And this is not easy to reinvest in the market again. This is capital flows being kept away from the market. So the argument about, well, we reinvest in the market, it's not necessarily absolutely true. How are you going to reinvest in the market when it's locked in a tax haven? You need to get it out there somehow. That's a problem for many companies. And the point is that you remove capital away from the market, you impoverish your own market. A market is where the people live, the physical, you know, warm human beings. This is not what's happening.
We should try to be quite efficient in terms of time. So here, another question.
Наталья Балакирева, Орел. Большое спасибо за ваш очень интересный доклад. Я бы хотела узнать про такую вещь. Насколько я поняла, вашей компании, в смысле, вашей организации в России нет. Это правда? Представитель организации. С чем это связано? Спасибо.
Yeah. Well, we are not kind of missionary as such, saying that you should do the same thing as we do. So we're afraid to be that because we don't want to come from one country and try to tell everybody else what they should be doing. But if people think that it's interesting or could be valuable to have a office, a publish what you pay office, it's up to them. Some countries might have other networks that already work efficiently for them. So, but we welcome everybody on board. I don't know if we have a Russian office. I know that we have many contacts in around Azerbaijan, who we've been in contact with lately, because there are huge problem for civil society there right now. But it's...
Инициатива должна быть из России. Я поняла. Нет.
The initiative must be taken from those who think that this could be a valuable a thing to have in Russia, and it's very easy. You just connect to the network. You can just write to me and I'll tell you how it is. But then you just sign up on that. You agree on these principles, and obviously we work for the same principles together. But from Norway, we are also autonomous. We have different problems than they have in Azerbaijan. We have different problems than Lebanon, than Nigeria. So it originates from what organizations here define as problematic. And we are using our capacity and our knowledge and our political context to do what we can. So you will be autonomous and you will define what's important for you to be working on. Yeah.
Okay, and I think we had a question here.
Альберт Каримов, Ямало-Ненецкий автономный округ. Очень понравился ваш доклад и доклад, который вы делали в Голицыно. Многие об этом обсуждают, но мало кто к этому подходит аналитически, вот с цифрами. Вот так как вопрос уже получал по России, а вот по другим странам вы как бы делаете тоже аналитику и по компаниям, которые вот у вас в Норвегии, вот вы отметили, что Shell наиболее больше, как бы получается, разрешал, да, доходы выводят в офшоры. А как бы вот есть какая-то градация компаний, то есть как бы там американские или какие-то компании другие больше выводят, эти меньше выводят, то есть как бы вот в этом плане.
I should be going into another presentation, do a whole presentation only on one of the reports which we made, which was piping profits, because there we had to make. We wanted some attention, so we went after 10 of the biggest companies in the world in oil and mining, and we also included the Norwegian company Statoil. But obviously, we're so few. We just have this one big company. So we had 3, and then we have 2, and then one. They're kind of eating each other up. And everybody else is kind of small mosquito companies. They're very, very small. So we wanted some more international attention with this report, and we had 100 spreads in international media. It was huge. There are, and obviously it's very costly. It demands a lot of resources and time in order to do investigations such as that. So obviously, you would need the resources first, but it would be super interesting to do it again, to look at other companies. But right now, it's more of the things that, for example, a journalist in Sweden and Norway has been calling me about Somalia and one little company. I don't know if I can say that in public right now, what's going on, but there are investigations on one of the small mosquitoes companies in one particular country, and that's another way that we can help inform, the little piece of information that we have and connect with others, so that you can have an end result that is much, much bigger. But obviously, these things would be extremely important to do, but it would require number crunchers and financing, and we used 4 months, 5 on our report. So. Yeah, but that creates attention, so that is very, very important.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. We don't really have time, but we'll have it anyway.
Спасибо. Ольга Фадеева, Ханты-Мансийский автономный округ. Для информации, в нашем округе добывается более 50% всей российской нефти. У меня следующее такое вот есть размышления такие и вопрос. Значит, в связи с тем, что я вчера уже поднимала вопрос менталитета. Дело в том, что в Российской Федерации очень многие граждане вообще не знают про Конституцию, про ее суть, и что все ресурсы и недра принадлежат самому гражданину, да, народу. И здесь идет речь о том, что ни в школах, ни в других организациях учебных не дают основы вот именно тем базовым знаниям, которые должны быть потом применены и для того, чтобы потом истребовать у государства те обязательства, которые они должны, собственно говоря, народу в налогах отчитываться. Так вот, проработав очень долгое время в школе, я ни разу не слышала и не видела, чтобы нам, детям преподавали вот эти азы. И мне хотелось бы узнать, вот в Норвегии, каким образом вот эти знания уже даются в школе, в институте, либо это идет на уровне менталитета уже в воспитании.
Yeah. I don't know. What do you think, Indra? I don't think that we have it so much either. I think that there are ways that we learn to know something because it has been worked very much into our Norwegian narrative as a successful history. We're calling our oil fields names from Norwegian mythology. It's a way of being proud of it. There has been some movies made, you know, why did we succeed? But obviously the stories have different sides to it. You know, what happened to the workers who worked there? What happened to the divers who dived there? There are many stories who are not being told in the kind of official narrative. But the legal concept that the resources belongs to the people, that is also being challenged in many countries. It's some state does not feel that they represent the people. They look upon the resources as their own resources. This is difficult in international law, but the resource belongs to the country, and the leadership has to make decisions on behalf of that country, and whether they do that or not. Obviously, when you have, even in Norway with a high level of education, I think there probably will be a higher degree of students who may know, but it's not, these things are not something that is being, what I'm talking about here today is not something that you learn in a school. These reports has been made because we haven't found the connections. We haven't seen this in any reports. We have seen reports on this, on this, and this, and then we go and check it, and we see how much is it used, how is it used, which instruments are used, what are the techniques, what are the results, to which degree is the extractive industry using this, and then you kind of start putting together the puzzles, and you're saying that obviously, if you cut the information flow, you will not see the whole picture. And we see that all of the processes in the OECD and the IMF, everybody, all of the processes are heavily influenced. For example, in the Dodd-Frank in the US, consumer groups, not our groups, but they managed to send 200 people to lobby on behalf of, you know, public groups who are concerned about, you know, a common good. And then you could see industry groups who sent over 400 lobbyists. So there's an asymmetry in representation, in knowledge, in financing. Hence the importance of a network that you can attach to it, you can connect to each other.
Okay, I am afraid that we need to finish now to make space for the next speaker because we have a slightly tight schedule. So thank you very much, Mona.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then we will go straight over to the next speaker.
I can use this, but can I just? So now we are going to the next presentation, and the second presentation today will be presented to you by Samson Tokpah, who works as a regional director for West and East Africa at the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and at its international secretariat here in Oslo. Samson holds an MBA degree in finance and Master of Arts degree in economics. And prior to joining the EITI, he was working in Charlotte, teaching economics there in the college. Then he also works in operations improvement at Carolina's healthcare system. After that, he joined EITI and worked as senior budget and financial analyst at the Novant Healthcare, at the EITI in Liberia and or other countries of Africa. So it's our great pleasure to welcome Samson here. And these are the printouts of presentation of Samson. So would you please distribute this to all other participants?
Help me get this right.
This is for interpretation.
Okay, great. Okay. Excuse me. Let me know when it's 20 to 12. When it's 20 to 12, 20 to 11. So I allow time for questions. So when it's yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Great. I'm happy now. Let me quickly say thank you to NUPI for the opportunity to sort of present the EITI perspective to you. I'm also quite pleased that I, came quite immediately right after PWIP, because I think you lay out the stage quite well and probably did some of my work. So I'm happy because you made my work, or you've made my work easier. Now, having said that, let me go into sort of an overview of what the EITI is all about. And by definition, the EITI stands for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. How many of you have heard about the EITI? If so, just raise your hand. Any of you have heard about the EITI? Okay, good. So, no, I'm not counting you folks. Okay, I'm not counting PWIP. But what I would try to do is to give you an understanding of what we hope to achieve and some of the successes and probably failures we've had to date, and how we all can work collaboratively to make sure that the resources in our respective countries work well for us. Now, there's a fundamental question. The question is, who owns the resources in my country, in your country? And the sooner we can answer that fundamental question, the sooner we can begin to appreciate the essence of the EITI. And the underlying assumption for us is that the natural resources in our respective countries belong to the citizens. When I worked as a national coordinator in Liberia a couple of years ago, it's quite funny that I would stand before the president, and I would stand in an audience where there are ministers of government, and I would purposefully call their names, and I said, the resources that belong to all of us, not the president, not the minister. And they appreciated that because it helped to shift the debate, the argument. Now, I use this example all of the time. If I had a car in Norway, and I don't foresee myself owning one because it's quite expensive, but if I had a car in Norway, and I said, I asked him, look, this is my car, I pay the insurance, drive it across town. obviously, the way he drives that car will be quite different. He's not going to be mindful if there are holes. He's just going to get into those holes and bump wherever and bang it up because he's not paying for it. He doesn't own it. I will pay for it when it gets damaged. But if that car is yours, the way you treat that car, because if it gets damaged, you have to pay for the repairs. That's kind of the argument I want us to see. If we begin to understand that the resources in our countries belong to me and you and everyone else, then we begin to ask the kind of questions about how the resources are applied to social services, how the resources are exploited, and who are the ones exploiting or extracting these resources. And whether, in fact, the resources are working well and working well for the citizens. So that's the fundamental question that underlies the EITI. So citizens should have the right to see what the government is receiving from the mining sector, from the oil sector. But in many places, the information is not quite available. Because understand, we are trying to form a debate. If I must intelligently ask my state minister or the representative from my district, then I must have the information, accurate information to say, why did you argue? Why did you debate? How did you vote in this manner? And it's also good for citizens because many times we assume that everyone out there is corrupt because we don't have the information. So everyone wins at the end of the day if the information is publicly available. Now, let's look at the value of resources coming, say, from Africa in 2010. It says that the value of extractive resources, the value of exports from the mining sector and the oil sector was almost 7 times the value of support to these countries in terms of international aid. In other words, if these resources from oil and mining in 2010 were managed well, you can see the demand for international support would be minimized. Rephrased. Countries are asking the international community to help them. But many times, they have what it takes to solve their own problems. They have the resources. But these resources are drained through corruption. And so people never really get to understand or appreciate the value of the resources. So through the EITI, when a country implements EITI, there is some degree of transparency over how revenues from the extractive sector is used. But here's fundamentally the core of the EITI. We are saying that countries extract or generate revenue from the oil, the mining companies. That information is very scanty, very seldom public or the citizens have access to that information. And therefore, we cannot form a good debate. The EITI initially settled on 2 core objectives. One, make this report, this information on what you are collecting from companies. Make it a public information so we all know what Statoil is paying, what Chevron is paying, what Exxon is paying. But we do not want the government solely to present that information to us. We want a process in which the government will say, this is what ExxonMobil paid to me, without ExxonMobil looking at that information. So government gives me this information, I keep it. ExxonMobil gives me the information on how much he pays to the government, I keep it. Then I find an independent auditor, reconciler, we call that administrator, who looks at the two information and validate what we call reconcile the information and present that to the public. What it does in the process is that it enhances, it builds trust on the side of the citizens for government, that indeed this information has been reconciled. And if there are differences, then we have to figure out why. If the company says I pay $5 million and the government says I received $3 million, what happened to the $2 million? So that's the essence of the EITI reconciling payments and making that information publicly available. But here is also what makes the process unique. It is led by government. No one wants to take away governance from government. But we are asking, this process of bringing credibility to these numbers that are provided by the companies and the government should be a triangular arrangement, a tripartite arrangement, what we call a multi-stakeholder group, where 3 different parties come together to say, yes, the information is correct. The government should be a part of that. The companies that provide the data should be a part of that. The civil society should also be a part of that. So you can see that all angles are represented to validate, to bring credibility, to say, yes, the information is correct. And our belief and the experiences we've had since implementing the EITI is that when you have these 3 individuals sitting around the table, it's not intended to be peaceful, because you can see that civil society is always almost at extremes with government and the companies. Historically, the relationship has been between government and companies. So we bring in that 3rd layer, the civil society, into this equation. Why it is not intended to be all lovey-dovey, the thing here is that it provides the forum, it provides a space for people who may not have ordinarily sat in the same room to discuss. It gives them an opportunity to discuss and iron out differences. It helps to consolidate faith and confidence in government. So these are the core things that the EITI operated on. But let's face it, if one of the objectives here is to minimize corruption, then I'm asking myself this question. By making information publicly available, by just telling me how much the companies pay and how much the government pay, it does not solve all of the problem. It's an important first step. I then begin to ask myself, but how are the contracts, how are the concessions awarded? Because mind you, the payments don't come from a vacuum. They originate from the concessions that are signed, the contracts that are signed, the agreements that are signed. So my thing is that if the argument remains, just show me the payments, garbage in, garbage out. If bad contracts produce bad numbers, You can remain EITI compliant all you want, but the people aren't yet benefiting. So we have to go to the core of the problem. That led to demand from many stakeholders that the EITI has to move a step further if it must ensure adequate transparency over the management of the resources. So there were proposals in 2011, 2012, and last year in Sydney, Australia, the EITI board, and by the way, that international board is constructed to include government, civil society, and the companies as well. Just as it's implemented on the local level in countries, it's the same structure that we have at the international level. So that group at a global conference adopted a new standard to strengthen transparency, not just reduce it or keep it at bay, payment reconciliation. So what does the new standard say? Or what does the standard say, I should rephrase that. To strengthen transparency across the entire value chain, in the entire process of the management of the extractive resources, then we must begin to provide information on licenses and contracts, on production. If I'm talking about payments to government by the companies, just think about it. Royalties. Royalties are paid on production. The more you produce, the more you pay. But if I'm only reconciling payments and have no information on royalties, I'm not telling all of the entire story. So the EITI standard talks about providing information on production. Then the fundamental, which has to do with the tax, payments, and reconciliation, and how revenue from the extractive sector, how revenue is allocated to different regions and different social services and all of that, and how at the local level this money is spent. So you can see we are talking about adopting transparency throughout the entire chain of how extractive resources are managed. So we talked about this, produced the reports, but let's look at this in more detail. The companies, when I talked about on a tax collection, the companies provide the information, government provides the information, that information is reconciled, and of course, it becomes public. We are now asking for additional information in this tender, that you must provide information on contracts and licensing. Make that, if you have a database at the Ministry of Mines, who owns what? Can we make that information public information? State ownership, does the state have rights, shared ownership in the oil sector, in the mining sector? And if so, can you disclose that? For some countries, like in Liberia, I think Nigeria, they have EITI laws. And it's mandatory for them to provide, to make contracts publicly available, all contracts by law. But the EITI is encouraging that you, at this point, encourages that you make the contracts publicly available. So each country has, and that's one thing that's quite unique. We have the minimal conditions. However, each country can build onto that. So what is true that the EITI is only encouraging that you disclose or you make contracts publicly available. Some countries have made that a law and is therefore mandatory in their countries. Beneficial ownership, which is part of the new standard, which is part of the standard that was approved last year, is in the pilot phase. It's been encouraged. And the essence here is, if we must actually promote transparency, I want not only that you make the contract available to the public, but let's go a step further. What share do you own? What share do I own? Who owns what? Maybe, and just maybe, this oil contract went through the national legislature so quickly because the folks who are in the legislature, or the folks who are the ministers, maybe, and just maybe, I have no evidence, but just maybe because they have interest. So that could be a reason why some contracts are expedited. But let's look at it on the positive side. It helps to build confidence. It helps everyone to get involved in how and who manages our resources. Production data, we want to understand how much volume. It's not sufficient to argue that the company paid $5 million in royalties. Maybe I need to know how much was produced and what was the market rate at the time. So I multiply production quantity by price. It makes it easy for everyone. And not just singly provide a number and expect me to accept that. Are there payments, transfers from central government to regional governments, to state governments, with monies that were generated from the extractive sector? If so, how much? So at the local level, I know that $5 million came from ExxonMobil to my district. And therefore, I can ask my local officials, how did you expend the $5 million? But until that information is available, I can only assume, and that's not good for any society. And finally, how did the local officials, or how did the government, central government, spend the monies, the revenues that were generated from the extractive sector? So this is the essence of the standard. This is where the EITI is going, asking questions beyond revenue transparency to a larger space, about a larger arrangement of how the sector is managed. Last week, there were 46 implementing countries. There was a board meeting in Myanmar this week that ended yesterday. And 2 countries, I think it's UK and Colombia. Yeah, 2 countries just were accepted. The United Kingdom and Colombia were accepted as implementing countries. So I had to change. If you looked on your presentation, it says 46. I had to update that this morning. So we now have 48 implementing countries. And since we've started this work, we have reported about 200, compiled about 200 reports and about $1.3 trillion in revenue. Now, I did say that this week the board accepted the candidature of United Kingdom, Colombia. Currently, France, Italy, Australia, and Germany have taken steps to implement the EITI. Germany and Australia will they're trying to implement on a pilot basis, so they're not going all the way, but at least they're interested in the process. When citizens are involved in the process, they ultimately ask the right questions, and they probably are certainly able to contribute meaningfully to how policies are crafted. What are some of the benefits of the EITI? In a country like Liberia and East Timor, Yemen, it's about helping to build trust. Let's look at Liberia, for example. While it's true that EITI has helped in many other ways, one of the core reasons EITI was adopted in Liberia was to help consolidate the peace after the war. In other countries, they are more complex, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kyrgyzstan. It's about finding ways how you track, how you use revenue. There are other countries with quite weak institutional systems, like Chad. It's about diagnosing, a more diagnostic approach to understand the crux of the problem. And there are other countries like Norway that is quite sophisticated. The question in Norway is not about public trust. I don't think Norway joined the EITI because of that. It's more so about trying to find more creative ways to make the information available and accessible to the public. The point I'm trying to make here is that different countries will implement the EITI for different reasons. Primarily for public trust, but you can see that based on the sophistication of your own country, you may certainly have different needs and maybe at different places or stages in the EITI implementation. However, it still works for everyone. Let's look at Ghana. Since Ghana implemented the EITI, and one thing I want to be quite mindful of saying is that the EITI is not the does not provide all of the solution. Sometimes when we present the EITI, folks leave with the understanding that we are saying the EITI has solved all the country's problem. No, we are saying when you put the EITI into this mix of things, there is a pretty good probability that it helps to increase revenue. It helps to build public trust. The EITI, in fact, is not meant to replace existing systems in countries. And that's one thing that is always never fully understood. It's not about trying to replace institutions in government. It's about trying to look at existing systems and structures and try to strengthen those systems and structures within government. So we can see that in Ghana, it has contributed to an extent, or has been part of the mix in increasing revenue since implementation in Ghana. You can see that. In Tanzania, for example, it's been able to break down the most systemic and brilliant way how contribution from the sector is allocated or comes from these different sources. Corporate taxes, 7% withholding taxes, and all that. In Zambia, one information it provides here is that the private sector, when the private sector initially took over, was in charge of production, you can see what happened between 1960 and 1970 when it became state control. Production fell, and now it's been privatized again. It appears that production is going up. That kind of information the EITI can provide for you. Let's look at Nigeria. She established and implemented the EITI in 2004. Some of the good things that have happened is the continuous increase in revenue. Nigeria is a unique case, very complex country that has used the EITI not only to help increase revenue, but to fight fraud and abuse, go after outstanding payments, collect payments on behalf of government. The same example of in Nigeria, in Indonesia, it shows how the report will show how monies are allocated to different social programs across the country, and that's the kind of information we think people need to make informed decisions. But let's look at Liberia. Interestingly, I sort of worked on this. But Liberia, as part of its EITI law, authorizes the EITI to review the process by which government signs on to concession rights. Did the government follow the law? Did it follow the processes laid out by government? And so last year, Liberia reviewed about 68 concession rights, oil, mining. And for Liberia, she has included under its EITI scope agriculture and forestry. Again, each country has within its purview to add whichever sector she wants to add. Having reviewed 68 concession rights, the report shows that, can you hear me? Okay. Shows that only 6 of 68 concessions, agreements signed by the government passed laws or met the requirements as set forth by the government itself. So it means even the rules the government laid down for itself in awarding concession rights were violated by the government. Now, I used to be a teacher, taught economics for years. This is somewhere around 8.8%. So that's a strong F, fail, right? Now, if you were a teacher, if there's any teacher in the group and you try to scale an F or 8%, there is absolutely no way that student will pass. In essence, the EITI process in another country, while other countries may be emphasizing on revenue, which is the core of the EITI, another country said, we want to see how the contracts are awarded. And from this, she has begun to take corrective measures. The point here is that the EITI will lay down the minimum condition, and you can build on that however you so desire. What are some of the issues? Look, by making information publicly available, for me, it's not the only question in town. Now I have the information that the payments, what should have been paid from government, from the companies to government, were not all paid, or maybe they were paid and all of the money did not make it into the government's coffers. Then what? So there's an issue of accountability. It's not solely making the information publicly available, it's also the question, and which I believe will help to reinforce, strengthen transparency, is how do we begin to hold people, systems accountable. In many countries, the EITI continues to provide information. The information says this amount is missing. That process was violated. Where is the will to take corrective actions? So for me, that becomes still an ongoing challenge. And of course, my colleague from PWYP talked about the EU and US regulations on the EITI. How would these regulations help strengthen? And I expect there will be a lot more, maybe from Canada and other countries. Is it a good thing for the EITI? Is it a good thing for transparency? I say yes. Because let's look at a poor country in the middle of nowhere. If company flies in there and say, hey, this is the information, this is how much I mine, this is how much I produce, and this is how much I'm going to pay you. That little country does not have the sophistication, the connections to be able to validate some of these numbers. So that country's report is on an island by itself. But if that company is a US or European company, we have to corroborate, we have to compare. They have to report to their home country the same information they provided in that country. So it forces that country or that company to provide accurate information in that country, because she can be penalized in her home country for providing inaccurate information in that other country. And lastly, I will sort of just say that my colleague from PWYP spent a lot of time talking about the country-by-country reporting, which is excellent. I would just like to build up on that a little bit, that the EITI is also asking in the standard. And if you are accountants and you're a financial analyst, you understand by reporting at that level is not sufficient. We want to see how projects report on a project level, right? So it's just not country by country, but it's also project level reporting. So if ExxonMobil or Chevron has 3 oil fields, don't tell me, I made $5 million in Liberia and therefore this is, no. you have 3 oil fields. I want to know how much each oil field, because accountants have pretty brilliant ways, of, you know, I'm not going to go into all of that, but it's good for us if we must be able to provide the confidence and the information that people need to decide. Then we want to do country by country, but within country, project by project. Please visit our website. The standard is there. Lots of information, pretty good stuff. We will, that's my name, and I pretty much lead EITI implementation in Anglophone Africa for now. That's Liberia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Ghana, Zambia, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. So thank you so much. I hope I didn't bore you.
Thank you very much, Samson, for this great presentation. I think it's one of the best presentations I've heard in my life about the activities of EITI, and you made it very clear and also very transparent of what the EITI is doing. And I think now we have the time for the questions. So Indra is, looks like he's the first to ask a question.
I have wondered about the following thing, not just on the basis of this presentation, but in general about the EITI. As far as I understand, EITI only deals with the payments from companies to the government in a country. And with the revised standards, the idea is to look more closely at these payments and the background for the payments and the kind of expenses and so on. But we're still basically talking about the flow of money from companies to the government. So if that is correct, I wonder, could it be so that EITI is more attractive for a more authoritarian, less transparent, more corrupt government than for than it is for government that is only moderately authoritarian and intransparent and corrupt? And why do I ask this question? Why could EITI be more suitable? Is because if you're a dictator who has total power, of course you want to have full, or you don't mind at least, you may even want full transparency about what the foreign or what about the companies own to your government. And after that, once the money is in the coffers of your government, it's nobody's business. I mean, nobody has any opportunity to control you. So could it be that EITI is very suitable for very intransparent, corrupt, totalitarian governments?
Good question. The history of the EITI itself was to address the resource curse. From that angle, you tend to set a logical framework. But to rephrase your question, it's like asking me, why would Norway join the EITI? Sort of. In other words, she has less incentive to be a part of the EITI than a corrupt regime somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Transparency, I don't think, is a stock in time. It's a process. There is always and will always be room and need for improvements. While it is true that there may be less need for Norway to adopt the EITI as compared to another country, it still tells me that the system here, while distant from other countries, it's not perfect. There are still areas that may need improvements. You have the issue of contract transparency, beneficial ownership. These are things that Norway will want to implement. But here's the key to all of that. Norwegian companies do not operate in vacuums. They survive, they compete with companies in other countries. Statoil is in Tanzania, she's in Nigeria, she's everywhere way around. So it makes sense that a country like Norway that competes and survives in the space of other jurisdictions and other companies, in order to ensure that the Norwegian company is in a fair competition, abides by the same rules, then maybe we all, by adopting a unified standard, it makes it easier for a company here, for a country here to compete with another country out there. So I think to that point, it makes a lot of sense. There's still a need, there's still a demand for companies and countries, or for countries that are more developed, maybe less corrupt than other countries, to still form a part of the process, because they do not operate in a vacuum. They survive, they do business in those other spaces. And by supporting those spaces, by supporting the process in those other locations, you sort of create a conducive business environment for yourself.
Next question, who'd like to ask? Okay.
Спасибо, кстати, за очень эмоциональный, интересный доклад. Вот просто интересно по отношению к России. Выступали ли отдельные, может быть, какие-то компании с предложением о поддержке этой инициативы, либо с каким-то образом со стороны государства? Если были какие-то переговоры, то в каком русле они шли? Вот, я так понимаю, эта инициатива исходит от самих государств или от самих компаний, а от вас как бы нет, да? От самой организации не исходит. Вот. Ну, если были какие-то переговоры, то чтобы мы заканчивали, если вообще были такие инициативы. Спасибо.
Look, my colleague from PWIP will probably help me on this. The EIT has an origin, started in Angola, all right? Where the civil society said there was a need, we want the information published. So from that point, you can see that it was a civil society push. But the desire to initially publish the information came from the company. My point is that why the entire initiative should be implemented and led by government. You can have discussions at different levels. It can start with you asking your company, is this something we want to be the part of? And starting a debate from there, and that can elevate to the government, to the larger society. But to have it implemented, it's a government-led initiative. In terms of whether the EITI has been approached by the government of Russia, there can be discussions at different levels that I may not be privy to. But I know increasingly more and more countries from all around the world have indicated their interest to join the EITI. And you can understand I'm trying to be a little politically correct in answering that question. So I hope you, because some countries, you never know how much work that you're doing behind the scene. It may be at levels of the chairman or the board of the EIT that I may not be privy to, but where I sit, I will probably say, because of my focus region, I may not have pretty good information on Russia in terms of joining the EIT. But there may be things in the works.
Thank you. Next question.
The question about that the resources belong to the people. For example, Japanese has no resources, but they are very rich. Maybe something wrong with the institutions, but not with the resources.
Excellent question. Not every country has gold and diamond and iron ore. not every country has oil. So, but the essence here is the management of the extractive resources. So let's assume that you don't have oil, you don't have iron ore. Why would you want to join the EITI when the EITI core focus has been oil and mines? But mind you, in Liberia, and I think in Seychelles, Seychelles now is adopting the EITI to look at fisheries. It's part of their resources. You can use the principles to adopt or apply to any industry. It's the question of making information publicly available. Liberia adopted or included agriculture and forestry. Sierra Leone is thinking about including forestry. Ghana is thinking about including forestry. I think it's the Philippines are thinking about forestry as well. So many countries, everyone has the leverage of including whatever. The EIT is a set of principles that you can adapt and apply to any sector. It's focused on extractive sector, but you can include other sectors of the economy. So if it's tourism, maybe we want to know how much is coming in, how much is going out. Yeah.
Time, so we will have time for 2 short questions. Okay.
Does EITI work with offshore jurisdictions in case of transparency, and does it help?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Offshore jurisdiction.
Like tax havens, so that every major oil company have beneficiary owners in the tax havens, offshore jurisdictions. So do you work with them, and does it help?
Look, this is sort of the elephant in the room. And please feel free to chime in because some of the advocacy around this have come from PWIP, Global Witness, and everyone else. In my presentation, I talked about beneficial ownership, that the EITI is now encouraging the disclosure of the real owners, not the companies that say we own the companies, but the folks behind, the real human beings behind the ownership. And that will require going into strange places, collecting information, or asking people to provide information. For example, maybe the Cayman Islands, maybe a crazy country in the middle of nowhere, that people have shelters and tax havens. At this point, the EITI is encouraging that information disclosed. Whether we as a body directly go into these places, I'm afraid not. But we're asking folks who have signed on to do the EITI, to implement the EITI, if that's what it requires for them to provide accurate information, then they have to adopt processes, standards, ways, regulations, or whatever it takes to provide the accurate information. But we as a body, I think we're only 20 staff. You know, be real crazy. We set this standard and ask folks to implement. You want to add to that?
If I may, I think it's obviously it has to do with where you are and what you want and where you want to be. In many, many countries, there's never before been a discussion between civil society and government on these issues at all. It might be an excellent platform to meet, to establish some trust and to be accepted as a civil society partner. Although the power asymmetry is not necessarily good, or they might be still not respected. At the same time, there's only so much each initiative can do. The EITI is not accounting information as such. It doesn't demand accounting information as such. It needs to be verified. What we're looking at is financial information. And I think the best way to see it is that it may supplement each other, because the EITI originated in a situation where there was no transparency at all. There was no information at all in the public domain. And this development has been happening so quickly. And we obviously run into different problems and different doors. And one problem that we are experiencing maybe more in the northern countries, where we already have mechanisms in place, such as in Norway, is that 5 years down the road, when we have been doing the EITI and doing it in a way that other countries have been able to copy and to produce the same information, we run into a problem that companies are saying that we don't need more transparency. This is a cap on transparency. Now and using the EITI as an excuse in order not to go into the topic of the secrecy jurisdictions. So, but that is not the situation in another country, which is on another, timeline on its transparency process. So we are experiencing completely different problems in different countries, which we need to be aware of. So in Norway, we have been coming to a point which is now being discussed, that EITI, for all that is good with the EITI, by the company side, it's used as an excuse not to do more, or to kick it into the EITI because they think that since they are a part of the tripartite process, they might have their hands on the wheel to a larger extent to control the process. But still, we have been able to get some aspects into the EITI which can, continue to use what we already have in the EITI, such as beneficial ownership. But these are the cutting-edge, difficult issues. So I do not think that EITI can do everything, should do anything, and it's not the solution for anything. At the same way as extended country-by-country reporting, it's not the solution for everything. It cannot target everything, but there you will get the facts on the table where the money is, which might lead to other questions being asked again. So it depends on where are we, what do we want, in which form, and where would we like to go. And just to see your options and which information will be produced by which initiative.
Thank you. I think our two speakers greatly complement each other, and it's possibly also the way for your organizations to complement each other too. So the time for a very short last question, if someone has, or еще вопросы, может быть, один какой-то. Если нет, well, if not, then we would like to thank Sam once again for the great presentation. Кофе-брейк пройдет не здесь, как обычно, а в коридоре, который находится сразу, выходя из аудитории. Если с этой стороны вы ходите налево, с другой стороны направо.
støtte, som er litt høyere risikoprofil, så har man mange forskjellige samfunnsaktører, ofte eksperter, men likevel det har vært veldig bredt tilfang av synspunkter som er med på å drive frem en sånn endring. Og det kan også være mer dramatiske endringer, det kan være ting rundt etikkrådet, som vi hadde et foredrag om forrige års. Ylva Lindberg, som sitter i etikkrådet. Så det er liksom tanken å få frem den der samfunnsdebatten, og siden du skal snakke om Norge, så er det da...
Jeg tenkte jeg har liksom et journalistisk blikk på det da.
Ja.
Snakke litt om hvorfor jeg synes det er en interessant historie, og hva jeg har merket med mitt arbeid. Jeg er jo fortsatt i researchfasen, så det er jo...
Hvor er du?
Jeg er fra Marseille. Ja, jeg har vært journalist i ganske mange år. Nå blir jeg som forfatter og skribent og rådgiver. Men jeg har ikke presentasjon, for jeg tenker at de har fått masse presentert. Jeg har ikke tegnet opplegget mitt, men jeg ser det er satt ned en time, men jeg har lagt opp til at det kanskje er litt diskusjon og spørsmål.
Ja, generelt er de veldig flinke til å stille spørsmål, men nå begynner de å bli litt fasta.
Ja, det gjør det. Så jeg har spørsmål til den egentlig.
Ja,
så det er egentlig for meg så er dette research.
Du kan snakke alt fra 15 minutter til fra 1 kvarter til 3 kvarter.
Ja, hvor jeg er på liksom men så har jeg lyst til å begynne med noen spørsmål.
Ja.
Jeg har lyst til å høre hva de tenker.
Ja, prøv deg frem.
Og så får vi bare se.
Ja.
Men det er ikke, men så baserer jeg på liksom hva de er interessert i. Ja, men bra. Kult.
Er det et økende fokus på skatteunndragelse i Russland nå?
Det er ganske stort fokus på det hele veien. Det er veldig vanskelig å gjøre noe med det.
Det var jo overraskende få som visste meg.
Det tror jeg kanskje også fordi han stilte spørsmål på engelsk, og så ventet han ikke på oversettelsen.
Ok.
Og så de som snakket engelsk sa ja med en gang, og alle de andre satt og hørte på oversettelsen, og så når de hadde hørt oversettelsen, så sa han gått videre.
Det er jo litt sånn her i Nittedveien med å ha en oversetter, men man må ta det litt rolig.
Man må ta det rolig, det er veldig viktig, og kan være veldig vanskelig å huske på. Nå begynner jeg å snakke 3 setninger, så går folk ut. Noen var veldig flink til å snakke sånn her sånn. Men ja,
Hva snakker jeg?
Ja. Men så
Jeg skal bare løpe på toaletter. Er det her?
jeg er ikke helt sikker. Unnskyld?
Toalett er det her.
Rundt der med kaffe der. I will just present as a toilet. Present as a toilet. Wait 5 minutes. Fordi grunnlaget for å ha en sånn, det jeg pleier å si at Olje for utvikling prøver jo også å spre og dele norsk kunnskap om institusjoner da. Men mye av det de gjør ligger på, særlig i begynnelsen når det forskningsfiske, altså ligger veldig på ganske formelt nivå. Så de sier liksom, ja, du må ha sånn konsesjonssystem, og du kan ha sånn skattesystem, og se så høye skatter vi har i Norge likevel, så er selskapene her, og oljefond, og noe av liksom sånn og sånn, som noe av oljedirektoratet, det kan gjerne hovedstaden. Ikke sant, sånne, mens det som egentlig får det til å fungere, er jo den offentlige debatten og sivilsamfunn og mediene som får plass på, tenker jeg. Så på en måte, den offentlige debatten og sivilsamfunn og mediene får institusjonen til å faktisk fungere. Men så er det jo friheten og talefriheten egentlig som får debatten til å fungere. Så det grunnleggende er talefrihet, og der er det jo en del utfordringer i Russland. Så lenge man ikke har frie medier som kan kritisere fritt, og hvor borgere og organisasjoner og alle kan si ting fritt, så vil du ikke få den debatten, og da vil den debatten kunne hjelpe myndighetene med kvalitetskontroll og med å forbedre seg og stadig utvikle seg.
Men disse deltakerne er journalister og NGOs?
Stort sett ikke. Det er noen journalister, en journalist i hvert fall.
Ja, men de er da...
Det er mye forskjellig. Litt journalist, litt NGO, litt
Sånn at ikke du, ja, men sånn at ikke den vender bakover eller ned i noe haka eller over
Nei, på siden.
Ja, det er det ene, og når de spør deg, så må du ha på den for å høre oversettelsen.
Må jeg det, ja?
Ja, for at
Etterpå, mens du snakker.
Den, ja, men etterpå så blir det oversatt fra russisk, og så får du det engelske i øret.
Ok.
Så det er sånn det virker her.
Men ja, hvis det er noen som vil stille spørsmål på engelsk underveis, det er mulig det. Det er fint det.
Så her er det bare slår du av og på.
I de boksene. I den boksen der.
Så det er litt sånn, jeg bare tenker på sånn hastighet, men det får vi bare...
Ja, du må gå sakte. Det er veldig lett å glemme. Du trenger ikke å snakke så sakte.
Nei, men jeg må ta pause.
Du må ta pause mens du snakker. Jeg snakker så jevnt. Og går litt sånn frem og tilbake. Men det er jo sånn, det er veldig systemet. Man må snakke sakte. Det står veldig jevn, og nå er det småsnakker, altså innhold også. Så kan du gå relativt sånn jevnt og trutt.
Men jeg sier når jeg starter, bare se på og si at de må komme vinklet her.
De gjør det, de kommer ut og skriver på det sånn. For det er mange som bare har på. Så jeg tror det er... Så bare begynn å snakke, og så vil de si fra hvis det er noe. Хорошо. Okay, everybody. Тишина всем. Все, пожалуйста. This will be our last proper presentation. After this presentation, we will have a little bit later just a short kind of a closing session, a very informal thing. And then later on today, you will be taken on a bus ride around Oslo. But this last presentation and highlight of our seminar is by Asle Skredderberget, who's a former journalist, but he kicked the habit, and he is now writing a book about the Norwegian Petroleum Fund, or the pension fund, as it is technically called. And I think I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. And actually, it's not even going to be a real presentation. I'm just going to talk, if that's okay with you. There's no slides, there's no figures, there's no... yeah, I'm just going to talk about it, why I'm doing this project, what I find interesting about the oil fund, as I call it, or the pension fund, or the petroleum fund, and
and also what I've sort of discovered so far in my book project. All right, so, and just to sort of say this up front, you guys are now all part of my book. This room now, we are in my book. I just want to mention that to you. I'm going to come back to that later and explain it. And you guys translating, wave if I'm talking too fast, all right? Good. Okay. I understand there's a couple of journalists in the room, or some journalists? Yeah, some. And some people also have been working as a journalist and then now work as something different, or yeah. How many have been working as a reporter, as a journalist? All right, me too. Okay, good. So what I want to do, I want to talk about this from my sort of Norwegian journalistic perspective. And then hopefully we can maybe exchange a couple of questions and ideas afterwards. So my background, I need to talk a bit about my background because it explains why I just had to do this project. Because someone really had to write about the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, in my opinion. So my background is basically from, I studied business administration and then specializing in finance. I did that in Bergen, on the west coast of Norway, and then in Milan, in Italy, at the Bocconi University. But I found out that I wanted to be a writer. So I skipped sort of the corporate life and started journalism. First in a financial newspaper, small, very narrow. I wrote about fund management. This was in 1996. And then I stayed there a couple of years and I moved to a bigger newspaper, a business newspaper. And then I moved to TV. So my sort of journey as a journalist has been from very narrow finance into the area or the intersection between business and politics. And I think that's a really interesting area to be in, especially in Norway. I mean, where business and politics go together like this, and probably where you're coming from as well, I would guess. So then after TV, I did an internet startup. I launched what is now the biggest business news site in Norway. And then I found out that, well, the thing is that when you do journalism in Norway is a really small country. So when you've done that for 12 years, you sort of interviewed the same people all over again. You've interviewed them 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. So you want to do something different. And I wanted to learn more about business. So I became an advisor. And then I was offered a job in Yara International. Does anybody know what Yara International is? Anybody heard about it? It's one of the biggest state-owned companies in, well, it's partly owned by the Norwegian government. And it does fertilizer and chemicals. And I'm not going to go through all of my CV, but it sort of leads up to what I'm doing now. They're in 50 countries all around the world. They sell to 120 countries. And what I did was I traveled to many of these countries and talked to people and made communication strategies. And what happens when you, like now, when you're doing this class here, afterwards you're going on a bus ride or you go out for dinner, then you start talking about what's it like, where are you coming from? What are you doing here? And that happens a lot when I was traveling. And all the time the conversation was about Norwegian economy and the oil fund. So if I was having dinner in Bangkok after a workshop, we would talk about the Norwegian oil fund. If I was in New York, we would talk about the oil fund. In Sao Paulo, same thing. Everybody was interested in the oil fund. And that was very intriguing for me. I think that was, it sort of triggered something. And I didn't know what to do about it just right then and there. But it was in the back of my head all along. And while I was doing all this, I actually also wrote a couple of books. So that's a different thing I've been doing. I've written 2 crime novels. which is something completely different. And then I've written non-fiction documentaries. So, and I wanted to do more writing, so I quit my corporate career in Yara, and I wanted to do writing. And this is just a couple of years ago. And at this time, I was thinking, I want to write something about business, finance, and politics from Norway for an international audience. What should I write about? Of course, the oil fund. I mean, the petroleum fund. It's there. It has all the ingredients. It has business. It has finance. It has politics. And I probably did a world record in landing a book deal, because I was approached by a literary agent and a publisher, and they asked me what kind of projects I was looking at. And I said that I want to write about the Norwegian oil fund. I want to write the story of the oil fund. And it took 30 seconds before the publisher said, okay, I'm going to publish that. You're going to write it, I'm going to publish it. So in 30 seconds, I had a book deal to do the oil fund. And when we talked about it, we were so surprised that no one had actually done it, because, I mean, Norway is it's a very, like you probably know from what you heard from others, it's a very open country. We have a public debate about things. We discuss, but still, no one had written a book about the oil fund, a fund that is actually becoming the world's largest and with enormous power. And still, no one has sort of taken on the task. And I guess that when this newspaper wrote that I was doing this story, I think it was a couple of journalists in Norway that was thinking, shit, I should have done this, but they were too late. Because the thing with the oil fund is, as I see it, from my perspective, is that there's so many people that know we have it, but they don't know why, how it was built. If you ask Norwegians, I mean, 100% of them know that, or at least if they're more than 5 years old, they know that we have an oil fund. But I would guess that 99%, they don't know why and how it was created. And it's an incredible story to me as a journalist. I mean, it's mind-blowing as I see it. But if you look at the way Norwegian media has treated the oil fund, I think the fund has sort of been below the radar, if you can say that, because in the start it wasn't that much money there. I started as a journalist in '96, as I told you, and that was a time where you saw many people with a business background going into journalism. But we were writing about all kinds of other things. We were writing about the interest rates, about Statoil. We were writing about currencies. And we didn't, I have to say that there's no journalist in Norway that expected the oil fund to grow like this. One of the things I'm looking in my book now is, did the politicians know? Did they understand that they were creating a 5,000 billion NOK fund? Maybe a few of them, but I think they were very lucky. But the journalists had no idea about how the fund would grow. So the first couple of years, the coverage of the fund wasn't that huge in Norwegian media. But then we did see, I mean, I remember starting out as a journalist, the oil price was close to $10. And then in a few years, it broke the $100 limit. It was amazing. And we did stories on how the Norwegian budget would, benefit from that. But we didn't see the money going into the oil fund. So why is the story interesting to me? And why is it increasingly interesting? For me, it's a spectacular story, because actually it could have gone wrong so many places. I mean, it is a success story, no doubt about it. But it could really go wrong on, from the early 70s up to now. It could go wrong hundreds of places. I think also it's why it's interesting is that it's a paradox that Norwegians, that we collectively are becoming one of the world's biggest investors. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Norwegians hate speculation. They hate stocks. They don't like Wall Street. We don't like stock exchanges. And we are currently, together, the Norwegian people is one of the world's biggest investors. And I think that's a huge paradox. It's also a huge paradox that, I've studied business and read so many finance books and from American authors, and I think Norway has done all the things that you should not do because we have strong unions. That's not good, according to some professors. We have state ownership. That's not good. But still, we sort of managed to do it our own way. And I think also a really interesting aspect when I talked about where it could go wrong is that we could, back in when they found oil in the end of the 60s, and you had a number of American companies wanting to go into the North Sea. I mean, Norwegian politicians could have said, okay, sure, go ahead, welcome, just please create a few jobs for us. That's all we ask. I mean, that could be one reaction. But we didn't do that. We said that, yes, come in, please do that, but we're gonna be in control. And I think that's an aspect that's interesting. That I think it has to do maybe with the Norwegian DNA, that we like to do things our own way. Especially if someone powerful tells us to do something differently, then we do it another way. And for me as a journalist, writing a story, that's, of course, that's interesting. And I'm also, well, this book is going to be out in 1 year, so I'm still researching it. But I'm also looking forward to sort of looking at what it was like the first time the fund comes to Wall Street, because we didn't have that much money. And I think the Norwegian culture or mentality is a very strong contrast to what you meet in the city of London or Wall Street. Okay, so I quit journalism because it sounds strange, but Norway was so small. I had interviewed the same people dozens of times, which is not fun when you're a journalist. But when you're a writer, a small country is quite nice because it means you have access to sources. So what I did was, when I decided to write the book, first thing I did was contact former Prime Minister of Norway, Mr. Kåre Willoch, because I'd been working with his son. And I just wanted to discuss, what it was like in the 80s. He was Prime Minister in Norway in much of the 80s. And it was very important in trying to reduce the power of Statoil, which was then a really powerful company. And as I said, it could have gone wrong so many places throughout the history, because what they did was that they sort of reduced the power of Statoil, so not all the oil money came into that company. If they didn't do that, we wouldn't have the sovereign wealth fund today. We would have Statoil, and it would probably be the world's biggest company, because all of our resources would be in Statoil. But and then I sort of went through the list. I just looked at who has been finance ministers in Norway the past 20 years, and I called them. And of course, they all want to talk because it's a success story. I managed to talk to Stoltenberg just before he was leaving to his NATO job. And and it's interesting. And I think what's very striking to me is when I speak to then, politicians from different parties. We've had finance ministers from, from the really left side, from the Socialist Party, to now the very, very, very conservative party. And when you hear them talk, it's quite similar. It's not that a big difference. I mean, the speeches the finance minister of today, when she's giving a speech, she's from the Progressive Party, very conservative. I mean, the Socialist Party might as well give that same speech. And that's interesting. And I think because what you see is that Norwegian politicians have, at least what makes me a bit proud actually, is that you see there's an ability or an eagerness to discuss across party lines. Even though you have someone from the other party, they're not enemies. So when you look at the management of the natural resources in Norway, they agree a lot. The conservatives, the Democrats, and socialists, and the very conservatives. And it's a contrast if you look at other countries. I mean, a couple of years ago, it's just striking, I think, when you look at the United States, where you have Democrats and Republicans, and they can't even sit at the same table discussing the budget, and they just drive the country into a crisis. But what we've had here, and it's interesting, I think, in my story about the fund, is the way that Norwegian politicians have they've sort of reached across to each other, and they haven't gained voters, if you understand what I mean. It's they haven't done it to become popular. They've done it because in a longer term, it's the good thing to do. So that's one key element, I think. Politicians that are actually able to speak to each other. And then, of course, you have the bureaucracy, people working in the ministry. I think it's instrumental that you have the people that actually they don't think about their own position, their own power, but they also have the long-term view. And I think that's what makes this an interesting story for me to tell in the book, because if you look at countries that have a lot of natural resources, the rule is not that the whole people is benefiting from it. The rule is rather that you have a dozen people benefiting from it in the country. But what we've done here is actually distributing the wealth, and I think that's a fascinating story. So the first, I think, as I said, the first part of, the first money came into the fund in '96. The fund was established in 1990, but there wasn't any money there. They came in '96, and journalists weren't that interested. But it's really exploded the past years, the interest for the fund. And there's a real change now in the media and how we cover, how we write about the oil fund. It's gone from 0 to more than 5,000 billion NOK, and it will increase. And I think what I see and my prediction is that you have Norwegian journalists has gone from being proud of what politicians have actually done, to becoming extremely critical towards the fund. And I think actually that's a good thing, because that's the job of the press, to be critical, because you have a lot of power now situated in the oil fund. And while many journalists were, if not applauding, physically, maybe silently applauding what the fund have been doing, I think now they're sort of really scrutinizing the fund. So And my book, my prediction is that it will be the first of many books about the fund. You will have, first of all, you've already seen news feature coming out, very critical about how the fund operates, about bad investment strategies, about bad investments, about even though we have an ethical framework, are they really following it that, sincerely? So you will have journalists and writers really digging into it. I'm gonna write the story from 1960 until today, but you're gonna have people looking at very specific periods of the fund. That's my prediction. And another thing is that the past, I would say, past year or past 1.5 years, there has been a completely new public debate about the fund. It has moved from just reporting that, oh, now it's this big, wow, it's increased even more. Now, oh, wow, now it's this big. That has been sort of how journalists have reported. To more asking the question, how do we want to use the fund? So climate is an issue that's increasingly important. And I follow this because I'm active in social media and I'm on Twitter and everything. And I saw this, more than a year ago, how sort of opinion leaders were starting conversations about the oil fund. Conversations that have the sort of the logic is that it's too important that they can just do whatever they want. So, and the fund was a political decision. So I think you have opinion leaders who wants politicians to take more, not control of the fund, but maybe adjust the framework. So they want the fund not to invest in, for example, oil. I think there's many people who want the fund to be a vehicle or an engine to promote climate-friendly investments. But then you have a pretty difficult discussion. Is that the job of the fund? Or should they just invest in what they feel is what's going to give long-term value for Norwegian citizens? What's going to actually help us pay our pensions? But you will see a lot of criticism from Norwegian journalists, and probably also from foreign journalists, I think. If you look at what Financial Times or other newspapers are writing about Norway, 90% of what they're writing is about the fund. So the interest is definitely there, but I think they will also look at concrete, investments in their regions. So it's going to be interesting for me to to see what's coming out of that. All right. I don't know how much time I spent. I didn't time this. Luckily, no slides. I just want to. What I said was that you're all part of my book now because I'm doing research. As I said, it's really interesting that a delegation from Russia is here to learn about Norway and what we've done with our natural resources, and specifically the oil fund. So, if you don't mind, I would like to interview you. Is that right? I'm open for questions, but because this is, as I'm in research phase, I just want to know. You've been here now a couple of days. You learned a lot. You listened to people. What's the most interesting thing you've learned about the oil fund? You knew something before you came here, but what's the most interesting thing you learned? I just need a couple of answers, and then you can answer or ask me questions.
Вы знаете, я первый раз в Норвегии и вообще в скандинавских странах. И находясь здесь и встречаясь с разными экспертами,
которые работают здесь, в Норвегии, меня поразила вот одна вещь. Это то, что все эксперты вот говорили об этом фонде как о национальном достоянии, о том, что этот фонд – это будущее норвежского народа, что все думали о своих детях, о потомстве, что это потомство должно, вот благосостояние этого потомства должно быть обеспечено за счет вот тех дивидендов, которые будут получаться от деятельности. Вот эта забота о будущем меня, скажем так, очень тронула, да, и вот, очень мне понравилось то, что вы вот так вот действительно вот это благосостояние, которое сегодня с помощью этих ресурсов получено, оно будет направлено на благо будущего норвежского народа. Вот это вот меня. Спасибо.
Thank you. That's interesting. Very. Anybody else? Do I point or yeah or?
You can choose.
Who was first? I'll just. This is interesting. Very interesting for me.
Ярославль, меня поразила, очень приятно поразила ваша финансовая дисциплина и отношение к деньгам, к бюджету. Потому что, имея такой фонд большого размера и думая о том, что куда девать эти деньги, которые поступают, при этом вы не позволяете себе большое количество трат, вы, надо признать, что мы приехали, и мы увидели, что жизнь у вас дорогая, продукты, в первую очередь, продукты питания, они дорогие, налоги вы тоже не послабляете. То есть, несмотря на такое, так скажем, подушку безопасности, вы все равно готовитесь, наверное, к какому-то худшему варианту. Это вот сдерживание себя, финансовая дисциплина, еще раз повторю, меня поразило. Я считаю, что это сегодня очень актуально для многих стран.
That's very interesting. I just want to add there that I think you will see in other parts of public sector in Norway that they also are critical that why can't we use more money from the fund. But still, it's quite impressive that the politicians have been able to explain that no, we can't use everything. We need to save. So it's interesting point. Yes.
Российский Дальний Восток, он как раз славен тем, что сейчас там идет активная разработка, шельфовые проекты реализует ExxonMobil, и меня поразило то, как распределяются в Норвегии средства, полученные от добычи нефти и газа. То есть, вот, допустим, у нас есть Сахалинская область, куда, где непосредственно разрабатываются шельфовые проекты. Значит, именно Сахалинская область, она получает в рамках договора СРП по разделу продукции, соглашение по разделу продукции, значит, получает деньги в региональный бюджет. А область, это, видимо, в Норвегии как губерния, насколько я понимаю, административное устройство страны. Вот. То есть все остальные края и области, которые входят в Дальний Восток, то есть они ничего не получают вот от этих, собственно говоря, шельфовых проектов. То есть деньги уходят в федеральный центр и остаются конкретно вот в Сахалинской области. Насколько я поняла, в Норвегии распределение средств происходит иначе, и неказоносные губернии тоже получают средства вот в свой бюджет. Меня это, например, поразило и порадовало, и показало, что действительно справедливо, и подтверждается тезис, что недра в Норвегии действительно принадлежат народу.
Wow. Thank you. This is such good input. But you have to ask me, if you want to ask me questions, please do so. Can I, yeah, you first. So, yeah.
While having, what is interesting, what I found interesting, while having discussion about the pension fund, how to manage it. The final conclusion is pretty consolidated. So there are the opinions are not so radically different. So you have discussion about the certain things, but the overall idea to use only the revenues and so on is, I think it could be more discussion on that.
About how it's managed, sort of, yeah, more yeah. And there are some discussions in parts of the financial community, but that is not the most important. That's sort of more for the especially interested. So the discussion is more on the overall level, I think, yeah. No, I agree, yeah. Cool, there was some ego. Okay, I'll move over here afterwards, yeah.
When we discuss about Norwegian fund, our experts told us only good news, but maybe we discuss about some scandal, corruption in the fund, like journalists, you say something hot news.
Yeah, there was this really good news article in Dagens Næringsliv, which is the Norwegian Business Daily, where they looked at very particular investment in Formula One company. You know, Formula One, the race driving, yeah. It's a company that has, it's part of a corruption scandal, of course. And the fund has invested, I think it's close to 2 billion. I think it's an investment of more than $1 billion, I think. I'm not quite sure. So yes, they got a lot of criticism towards that, and a lot of questions was asked. You know, who are these people deciding? Who is it? Just a couple of men deciding for their own what they think it's fun to invest in? So there was a lot of criticism, but I think the fund also managed to answer really good. I mean, in the fund with I don't know 8,000 companies they're invested in, you will find a couple of not that good investments, of course. But there you will see, I think you will see more criticism on specific investments.
But what about the overall management of the fund? You know, as a co-owner of the fund, as a Norwegian citizen, I wonder sometimes. I've invested don't have very much money, but I invested a few $1,000s in stocks and in mutual funds. And I have never made less than 20%. Of course, when the market is bad or unpredictable, I just go out of the market. But I've never made under 20%, and I've made 60% also some years.
Wow.
So I just
Why
wonder,
are you in Nupi?
Well, but my capital... I only have, like $2,000 invested or something, so I can take very high risk too. It doesn't really matter.
Okay.
But I just wonder, these like 3-4% profit and these kind of a little bit above the index, maybe sometimes. Is it good enough? It doesn't seem very impressive to me.
No, but I mean, it's just so. It's a huge amount of money. So I mean, it's difficult to get 60% on 5,000 billion NOK. But I think the most important thing is not, it's not stock picking in itself that's important. It's when you decide the allocation. So if you, the important decision is, are you going to be 50% in stocks, or are you going to be 10% in property, or 0% in property? That's sort of where most of the dividends is decided. When you make that decision to go from, for instance, they had 40% in stocks, and then they moved it to 60%. It was amazing because during the financial crisis in 2008, the sovereign wealth fund was probably almost only one buying stocks. Everybody was selling. But the thinking was that, okay, we're going to buy anyway, and it's cheaper, so we're buying. But so the important thing is not exactly what stock you pick, but that you decided to be in this much in stock, this much in real estate, and this much in bonds. So I think that's, for me, that's also more interested in than of course I'm gonna go into specific investments and see what they've done. But I think so far it's of course everything can be done better, but it's difficult to compare that fund to your $2,000. I have to move over here now. I think sure.
Вадим Коростелев. Спасибо за интересно поставленные вопросы. Отвечая на ваш вопрос, прежде всего, я хочу сказать, что меня убедило, что в Норвегии есть достаточная демократия, чтобы обсуждать проблемы, и в том числе проблемы, связанные с фондом. Вчера профессор норвежской бизнес-школы Арне, он ставил вопрос о том, как меняется сознание норвежцев, когда они знают об этом фонде. Они чувствуют себя как миллионеры, которые на самом деле не миллионеры. То есть не они же распоряжаются в конечном счете этим фондом. То есть одно дело провозгласить о том, что фонд принадлежит народу, а другое дело добиться, чтобы это как-то соответствовало реальности. И мне кажется, что было бы интересно, мне, во всяком случае, прочитать в вашей книге о том, как прежде всего норвежцы задумываются об этом феномене преодоления стереотипа, который, как мне кажется, будет тормозить в дальнейшем развитие Норвегии. То есть чувствовать себя такими миллионерами по жизни. Вот. И богатство — это же такое вот оружие, это такой меч, который можно в любой момент достать и попробовать его использовать как бы для чего-то хорошего. Но, как правило, и это показывает опыт изучения голландской болезни, ничего хорошего из этого не получается. Вот. И разговоры о богатстве для будущих поколений, на мой взгляд, хороший идеологический лозунг для того, чтобы такой фонд создать, но он не очень хорош, когда этот фонд обретает реальные размеры и его реальная капитализация настолько мощная, что он становится таким серьезным ресурсом на международном рынке. И не только рынке экономическом, а рынке политическом. Поэтому вот обсуждение, дискуссии об этом, чтобы это не уходило когда-то на далекую перспективу, что когда-то, когда нефть закончится или когда будут трудности в Норвегии, мы тогда вернемся к вопросу о том, как мы будем тратить эти деньги там, и так далее, и так далее. О том, что эта дискуссия должна, как мне кажется, развиваться сейчас, чтобы передать будущим поколениям не только сам фонд, но о том, как надо бережно подходить и осторожно относиться и к деньгам, и к тому менеджменту, который там находится, и к тем политикам, которые принимают решения, и тем законам, которые есть. И вот тот китайский опыт, что они сделали 2 фонда, а не 1, мне кажется, как бы вот это некий ориентир, чтобы не концентрировать мощнейшую власть в одном месте. Мне кажется, вот это какой-то разумный ход для дальнейших шагов. Спасибо.
That's interesting. Thank you. Interesting. Yeah, I'll go for more questions because I would like to answer that, but let's. You there, please, and then afterwards you. Yeah.
Евгений Малышев, город Пенза. Из всего услышанного меня больше всего впечатлила цифра, что деньги нефтяного фонда работают в 48 тысячах компаний в 82 государствах. 48 тысяч компаний в 82 государствах.
48. Wow. I think it's 8. Yeah, yeah. It's a lot.
Да, это все равно большая цифра, и мне кажется, вот в этом заключается философия норвежской нефти. И мне кажется, у норвежской нефти вообще немного другая химическая формула. Это не просто нефть, которая вот добыта, попала куда-то, сгорела и ушла в воздух. она продолжает работать дальше в многочисленных сферах и приносит какие-то свои там эффекты. И особенность этой формулы заключается также в том, что она прозрачная, с ней каждый может познакомиться, каждый может увидеть, куда ушли деньги, добытые от этой нефти, на что они использованы, какие они дивиденды принесли. Вот это вот, я думаю, есть химическая формула норвежской нефти. И еще, услышав все, что мне здесь рассказывали о контроле за нефтью, за добычей, об общественных обсуждениях, вот мне кажется, норвежская нефть настолько демократична, что даже попадая в конкретный бензобак конкретного автомобиля, она продолжает думать, стоит ли мне работать, с благой ли целью едет этот автомобиль, стоит ли мне гореть дальше или нет. И она думает. Спасибо.
Very interesting perspective. Thank you. In the end, or in the corner, this is such good input.
Спасибо большое. Алексей Кабаченко, Челябинская область. Свой вывод за последние несколько дней, который у меня сложился, очень показательно было в один из первых дней график, который нам показали. Доходы, ну, как реагирует рынок, да, получается, такая вот, разные графики, да, и подход норвежцев к расходам. Максимально прямая линия. То есть неважно, каков доход, да, это может быть и пик, это может быть и падение, но расход всегда одинаков. Это ментальность норвежцев, в моем понимании. Чем отличается ментальность норвежцев от ментальности русских? В этом вполне возможно и проблема, да, подхода к самой экономике. То есть у русских есть такая поговорка «гулять так гуляй». Да? Сегодня, если денег много, мы гуляем шикарно, на следующий день деньги кончились, мы голодаем. Ну, гулять или в долг. Возможно, когда-то. И теперь мой вопрос. Ну, он не совсем связан именно к нашей тематике с нефтью, да, но он связан с политикой. Вы, как журналист, которые общались и брали большое количество интервью у политиков, норвежских политиков, у меня вопрос в чем состоит? Вы общались с различными представителями различных политических партий. Существует ли у вот этих вот политиков различных направлений политических партий какая-то политическая дисциплина, когда они на поставленные ваши вопросы, они давали ответы не так, как ну, правильно, да, а ответы в рамках своих каких-то идеологических направлений, только вот, ну, в таком узком туннеле. Спасибо большое.
Could I get a short version of that question again, please? Yeah.
Кратко. Задаете вопрос политику.
Mm-hmm.
Он отвечает по существу или же он отвечает в рамках своей политической платформы, политической партии, которую он представляет?
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, if you're a journalist and you're working in a newspaper, they answer you with a lot of, also in Norway, a lot of political bullshit. Excuse me for saying this. They talk, you know, they want to put themselves in the best light. When you're a writer and you talk to people who are no longer very active in politics, but they talk about, you know, 10 years ago what they did, I think you have a more open discussion. And that happens if you talk to the conservatives or the Democrats. I feel actually that you get more to the core of the matter, and they answer very honestly, I think. And also, I think the answers don't. There's not such a big difference between the Democrats and the conservatives when they talk about it. So I've interviewed, you know, the finance ministers from all the parties, and and when they answer it, I think they're very honest. But I'm gonna interview also today's finance minister, and I don't expect her to be that. Let's say honest is probably the wrong word. She's going to be honest, but she's going to be more of a politician. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but yeah, hopefully. I think we have one more there as well. Cool.
Наталья Назарова, Пенза. У меня вопрос такой. Вот в течение всего семинара мне хочется понять, нам доказывают, что взаимосвязано формирование норвежского фонда и силы развитости гражданского общества. Я бы хотела уточнить ваше мнение. Как вы считаете, чем мы принципиально отличаемся Россия и Норвегия? Почему мы не создаем такой фонд? Я имею в виду реальности. Мы создаем фонд, но мы не создаем механизмы этого фонда. Он не так действует. И не действует реально на благо общества. А норвежские политики почему-то выстроили эту систему. Это развитость и культура этих политиков, или это действительно такая сила гражданского общества, которая так сильно на них влияет?
It's a very interesting and very dangerous question for me to answer, because I don't know. I know a lot about Norwegian society. I don't know a lot about Russian society. I've read newspapers. I don't trust everything I read in newspapers. But okay. But in general terms, I think there's a really, really good book called Why Nations Fail. And I can't remember do you know the author? It's he have looked at civilization from 5,000 years back. What sort of those nations that really make it? What characterizes them? And those nations that fail, what characterizes them? And I think one of the key things is that you have a middle class that is stronger than the elite. So you don't have an elite that is extractive, that they're an elite that is more thinking about extracting natural resources for their own sake. And then you have to have but I mean I really don't know this much. I haven't studied it. I just read this, and I just found it interesting that you need those mechanisms and public services available. You need to have that in place to distribute the wealth. And I think I'm not going to go too deep into what happens in Russia, but of course there's a distribution issue. But I think what you see in Norway is that we really had the system in place to handle, the wealth. We had the ministries, we had the knowledge, we had, the institutions that you need. And I think that's really important. Without that, you just have a lot of money and a lot of fighting about what you want to do with it. But when you have the institutions, I think that's an important issue. Yeah.
The author is Robinson and Asle.
Okay, thank you. I really recommend the book.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. One of the wonderful and fantastic things that I heard here that Norwegian politician people thinking not about election and voting, but a long-term strategy. How it's crazy for all European politicians, like in Germany, in Greece, in US, thinking about election first of all. And how to prevent populists to go to the parliament. For example, I think Indra is a better manager than the Nordea Bank, and he can get 20%. And okay, I'll give every people in Norway by $100,000, and they manage it better than the Norwegian pension fund. And it's very popular.
All right, interesting. No, but I think the long-term view is very important. That they actually, because no doubt, they have not done it to become popular. But I mean, now they are popular because they did it. But they didn't, you know. There's still many Norwegians that want us to use more oil money, and that so they're still struggling. But it's interesting. You're probably aware of the rule we have that you can only use up to 4% of the revenue from the fund, and that's actually been looked as it reduces what we can use. I mean, that's Norwegians are thinking, wow, that's they're preventing us to use more. But it's actually a rule to use more, because the alternative would be to use nothing. So when I talk to Mr. Stoltenberg and other politicians about this, they sort of they're maybe a bit frustrated that it's been looked upon as a rule that that prevents us to use oil money, but it's actually a rule that allows us to use oil money. But it allows us only to use from the revenue, not from the fund itself, which is quite clever, I think. Oh, okay. We got more questions. Excellent. And or input for my book.
Спасибо за ваше выступление. Сергей, город Владивосток. Ну, наверное, будет интересно вам узнать, что, находясь здесь, я сравниваю Осло с Владивостоком. Эти города очень похожи и своим рельефом, и нахождением города относительно моря. У Владивостока с 3 сторон находится море. Население городов примерно одинаковое, 600 тысяч человек. Ну, это первое такое наблюдение. Второе. Удивительно экономно и рачительно норвежский народ сумел распорядиться вот этими богатствами нефтяными, которые свалились на его голову. Чего в России, кстати, в России это тоже смогли сделать, но определенная группа людей. Нам ничего не свалилось. Вот это второе наблюдение. И наблюдение третье, оно такое, наверное, долгосрочное. Дело в том, что в Евросоюзе часть государств находятся на грани банкротства. Это, например, Литва, Латвия, ну, прибалтийские страны. Ну, там ничего нет, они живут на деньги Евросоюза. С другой стороны, появляются страны, которые фантастически богаты, и их финансовые ресурсы растут год от года и множатся там в таких гигантских пропорциях. И вот такой диссонанс между странами бедными и богатыми Евросоюза, мне думается, в дальнейшем будут носить какие-то неприятные отношения, возможно, конфликты. Не знаю, как будет. Нет, это вот мое мнение, которое требует понимания и, может быть, какой-то политики.
Another dangerous question. Thank you. I'm probably not the right one to answer that one, but I think we're a bit over time, aren't we? But it's such a good discussion.
Okay, for another 5 minutes.
Yeah,
I think
sure.
it's okay. Or 10 minutes.
Now I have a question regarding to the management of the fund.
Okay.
So the obvious advantage is that you are very long. You as a co-owner of a pension fund. So you have a very long term. You are a very long term investor, and that's the real advantage. I looked through the portfolio, and I think the risk management is not so. There are a lot of tickers which are not in the same strategy. So a lot of companies have strategical problems for the years. So I think you should be the same. So since you are the extremely long-term investor, the tickers should be promising companies for the years and years. So there are a lot of say it better.
No,
Not very promising.
so because what as if I interpret you right, you're saying that, I mean, we are investing in sort of yesterday's companies, basically. Yeah, and that's I think that's the problem with fund management, and I think also that's part of the discussion in Norway when you talk about climate. It's also about green investing. Like, can the fund be used to promote green technology? Can you do, but yeah, can you do more startup investments? And
Energy storage and so
yeah,
on.
and there's also a strong opinion in some parts of Norway where you should, for instance, use it to invest in Africa, both because it's a good thing to do because they need infrastructure, they need investments, but also because it's probably good long term, because that's definitely venture capitalism. Yeah.
And another point is about the risk management is that I was really surprised to hear you still are in a lot of Russian securities. So it's they also have a lot of strategical and tactical problems, but mostly strategical. So a lot of even Russian funds sold Russian securities in 2011 or 2012 because of the market changes. So that's another point.
Yeah, interesting. I'm gonna make a note of that. Right, this is excellent. Okay, we have. Okay, yeah. One more question there.
Не вопрос, а маленький комментарий. Вот что обратил внимание,
Okay.
Несмотря на такую финансовую скрупулезность всех дел, которые ведутся в Норвегии, норвежский народ остался очень эмоциональным, ярким, живым. Вот вы разрушили мой стереотип о северных народах. И, возможно, это сочетание эмоциональности человеческой и скрупулезности финансовых вопросов. Спасибо.
All right. Good. Are we? That was a good summary. I'm just gonna. Of course I have to document that I'm actually here. So if you bear with me, I'm just gonna. Of course I need to. All right. Hey guys, smile. Cool. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Asle. That was a really good last session.
Thank you.
I'll just give some practical messages. Сейчас у нас будет обед по программе до часа, ну, скажем, до 15:02. В 15:02 встретимся здесь, я надеюсь, еще раз, чтобы совсем закрыть семинар окончательно. И в 2 часа отправляется автобус из гостиницы, из вашей гостиницы в 2 часа. Так что два времени, 1:15 и 2. Хорошо.